6 hours before their grand opening, I made one decision that turned $1 million dream into a sinking disaster. I drained the entire lake. Not metaphorically, not as a threat. I opened the floodgates and watched the water disappear beneath their floating restaurant while champagne glasses were still being polished for VIP guests. And the craziest part? It was completely legal. At exactly 5:02 a.m., I stood on my dock with a cold cup of coffee in one hand and a rusted steel lever in the other, the same lever my grandfather installed nearly a century ago. Across the water, their monstrosity floated like it owned the place. White marble floors, crystal chandeliers, a full luxury dining setup sitting right on top of what they claimed was community water. My water. They had banners up already. Grand opening tonight. Staff moved around like ants, setting tables, testing lights, laughing like they'd already won. News vans were scheduled. The mayor was on the guest list. Investors were flying in. And right in the center of it all was a lie. They thought paperwork made it theirs. They thought pressure would break me. They thought I was just some quiet old man clinging to memories. They were wrong. Because what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that this lake wasn't just land. It was a system. A system my grandfather built with his own hands. A system designed to control every drop of water sitting in that basin. And buried deep inside a 100-year-old contract was a clause so powerful it didn't matter how much money they spent or how many people they invited. When I pulled that lever, none of it would exist anymore. I remember looking out across the water one last time. The morning was calm. Too calm. Like the kind of silence you get right before something breaks. For a second I almost hesitated. Not because I doubted what I was about to do, but because I knew exactly what would happen next. Millions of dollars, gone, reputations, destroyed. A crowd of powerful people watching their perfect evening collapse into chaos, all because they chose the wrong piece of land. I took a breath, tightened my grip on the lever, and pulled. If you think that's where this story gets crazy, you haven't seen anything yet. Before anyone tried to steal it, before contracts and cameras and champagne tables showed up, this lake was the quietest place on earth. And that's exactly why losing it felt like losing her all over again. Most people see water and think property. I see 30 years of sunsets, a weathered wooden dock, and the sound of her laughter echoing across the surface like it never really left. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm 52, retired Army Corps of Engineers. I've worked on dams, flood systems, infrastructure most people never notice. But none of that ever mattered as much as this one stretch of land my grandfather left me. 40 acres of untouched wilderness, and a spring-fed lake so clear you could see straight to the bottom even at dusk. Sarah loved that about it. Every evening, no matter how busy life got, we'd end up on that dock. She'd bring her sketchbook, I'd bring 2 mugs of coffee, and we'd sit there in silence like the world had finally decided to leave us alone. The smell of pine trees, the soft ripple of water, the way the sky melted into orange and purple. It wasn't just peaceful. It was ours. We built everything here together. The cabin, the dock, even the small trail that wrapped around the lake. Every nail, every board, every memory, it had her fingerprints on it. And then, just like that, she was gone. Cancer doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't care how much you've built or how hard you've worked. One day you're planning the next summer, and the next you're standing alone in a hospital hallway, trying to understand how everything disappeared so fast. I buried her ashes under the old oak tree by the water's edge, same tree where we carved our initials 30 years ago. Her last words to me weren't complicated, no big speech, just one promise. Keep this place peaceful. So I did. For 2 years, I protected that silence like it was sacred. No noise, no crowds, just the lake, the wind, and the memories she left behind. It was the only place where the grief didn't feel so loud. until the day someone decided that peace was wasted potential, that my memories were just empty space waiting to be turned into profit. And that's when everything started to change. The first time I saw her, I knew she wasn't there to be a neighbor. She stepped out of a white Escalade like she was arriving to claim something, not visit it. Perfect posture, designer heels sinking slightly into my gravel driveway, but she didn't even look down. Her eyes were already scanning the lake behind me, calculating, measuring, valuing. "Mr. Morrison," she said, like she already owned the name. No introduction, no handshake, just a clipboard tucked under her arm and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Cordelia Blackthorne, HOA president. Problem. "I'm here to conduct a compliance review," she continued, flipping through papers like she was reading my future. "There are several irregularities regarding your waterfront usage." I almost laughed. This land had been in my family since 1923. My grandfather built half the infrastructure around here before her subdivision even existed. But she walked past me anyway, didn't ask permission, didn't slow down, just moved straight toward the dock like boundaries were optional suggestions. "You can't just," I started. "Oh, I can," she cut in, calm and sharp. "This community has evolved, and with that comes updated standards." Standards. That word hung in the air like an insult. She pulled out a freshly printed survey map, edges still crisp, ink practically shining. "According to revised boundary assessments, this lake falls within shared community access." Shared. I stared at the paper, then at her. "Ma'am," I said slowly, "this property is private. Always has been." She tilted her head slightly, like she was humoring a child. "That's a very outdated understanding." And then she smiled. Not friendly, not polite, calculated. "You're occupying a resource that could significantly increase property value for the entire neighborhood. Right now." She gestured around like everything I built was a problem. "This is underutilized." Underutilized. That dock? I built it with my own hands. That lake? It held my wife's last sunset. But to her, it was just wasted space. "You ever consider relocating?" she added casually. "There are beautiful communities designed for people in your stage of life." There it was. Not just greed, disrespect. I felt it hit deeper than it should have, but not because of her. Because she had no idea what she was talking about. "My wife is buried here," I said, my voice steady. For a split second, something flickered in her expression. Then it disappeared. "That's unfortunate," she replied flatly. "But sentiment doesn't override development." And just like that, she turned and walked back to her car, like the conversation was already over. But before she got in, she paused, looked back at the lake, then at me. "Things are going to change, Mr. Morrison," she said softly. And this time, her smile wasn't hidden. It was a warning. The first notice showed up taped to my front door like a warning shot. Bright white paper, bold red letters. Violation. I hadn't even had my morning coffee yet. By the end of the week, there were 3 more. Excessive vegetation, unauthorized structure, noise disturbance. I stood there staring at the stack, the paper still crisp, ink barely dry, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Cordelia wasn't trying to win a legal argument. She was trying to bury me in pressure. Every notice came with a fine, every fine came with a deadline, and every deadline was designed to make me react, to panic, to comply, to fold. I didn't pay a single dollar, because something about it didn't sit right. See, in my army days, I learned a simple rule. When someone attacks you with paperwork, you don't argue, you research. Turns out, HOAs only have authority over properties that actually agree to be part of them. Signed covenants, legal inclusion, paper trails. My land predated all of it by decades, meaning every single violation she sent me was worthless. But that didn't stop her. If anything, it made her worse. Within days, inspectors started showing up. County health, fire department, building code enforcement, different uniforms, same story. Someone had filed complaints, dangerous structures, environmental risks. Suspicious activity. I watched them walk my land, check my systems, inspect my cabin. Every single one of them left with the same conclusion: no violations. One inspector even pulled me aside before leaving. "Off the record," he said, lowering his voice, "we've been getting calls about you almost daily." I didn't need him to say her name. I already knew. And then it escalated. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to started looking at me differently. Conversations stopped when I walked by. People whispered. Flyers showed up in mailboxes warning about declining property values and unsafe surroundings. She was turning perception into a weapon. But the moment I realized just how far she was willing to go was the day I found my own property listed online, for sale. My cabin, my dock, my lake, photos taken from angles I never shared, descriptions written like I was already gone. Prime waterfront opportunity, currently occupied, motivated situation. Motivated. I felt something shift in my chest when I read that. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was a setup. She wasn't trying to control my land. She was trying to take it. And suddenly, every notice, every complaint, every whisper campaign started making sense. She wasn't pushing me out by force. She was doing it slowly, legally, systematically, like she'd done it before. That's when I stopped reacting and started preparing. I realized how deep this went the morning a stranger knocked on my door, holding blueprints of my lake. Not a rumor, not a warning, blueprints. He stood there in a pressed shirt, expensive watch, the kind of guy who doesn't waste time unless money's already involved. But his expression, that wasn't confidence. That was confusion. "Mr. Morrison?" he asked, glancing between me and his phone like something didn't add up. "I just need to confirm. Construction begins next week, correct?" I didn't even answer right away. I just looked at the rolled plans in his hand. "What construction?" I asked. That's when his face changed. Slowly, like a man realizing he'd just stepped into something very, very wrong. He unrolled the papers across my porch railing, and there it was, my lake, my shoreline, my dock, redesigned into something unrecognizable. A floating restaurant, full layout, kitchen placement, seating for over 100 guests, dock access points, utility lines, all mapped perfectly onto land I never agreed to give. "She said everything was approved," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Permits, environmental clearance, ownership verified." Ownership. That word hit different this time. "Who said that?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He hesitated for half a second, then said it. "Cordelia Blackthorne." "Of course." "She took a $75,000 deposit," he added, voice tightening. "Told us you were eager to partner." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. Because in that moment, everything clicked. The notices, the pressure, the fake authority. It wasn't about rules. It was about removing me from the picture long enough to sell something she didn't own. "She lied," I said flatly. "There was no agreement, no permission, nothing." The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, dangerous. Because now there were two victims standing on that porch, and one person responsible for both, and that's when it got worse. Over the next few days, more names started surfacing, more investors, more deposits, different versions of the same promise. Exclusive waterfront opportunity, guaranteed returns, limited access. She wasn't just building a restaurant. She was running a full-scale scam, using my property as collateral. And the most insane part? Construction didn't stop. Trucks showed up anyway. Equipment started rolling in. Workers began setting up like everything was perfectly normal. I walked down to the shoreline and watched it happen in real time. Steel frames, floating platforms, materials stacking up, all of it on my lake, without permission, without legality, without hesitation. That's when I knew this wasn't something I could stop with warnings or conversations, because she wasn't afraid of being wrong. She was betting everything on the idea that she wouldn't get caught. And that meant one thing. If I wanted to stop her, I had to let her go all the way, right up to the moment she thought she'd won. The moment I realized what the HOA had done, I didn't feel anger first. I felt disbelief, the kind that sits heavy in your chest when someone crosses a line so obvious you think it must be a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. They had turned my private lake into a public spectacle overnight, building a floating restaurant right in the middle like they had every right in the world to do it. By sunrise, it looked unreal. Lights strung across wooden platforms, tables arranged like a luxury resort, staff moving around as if they were on scheduled payroll. And people, actual people from the neighborhood were already showing up, laughing, filming, treating it like some kind of community festival. No one stopped to ask who owned the water. No one cared. And that's when I saw the HOA president standing on the dock, smiling like a man who believed he had already won. He even waved at me. That wave did it. Not the construction, not the crowd. That single gesture told me everything. I wasn't dealing with ignorance. I was dealing with entitlement. So I turned around and walked back without a word. No confrontation, no argument, no emotional outburst they could twist against me later. I went straight to the file cabinet and pulled out the deed records, the ones they always assumed I would never actually use. Every legal line, every boundary marker, every water right clause was there in black and white. They hadn't just crossed into my property. They had built a business on it. And that meant I didn't need permission to shut it down. One phone call was all it took. Calm voice, simple instruction. No threats, no explanations. Lower the lake. At first, nothing happened. The restaurant kept running, music playing, plates being served. People were still taking pictures, unaware that their entire foundation was about to betray them. Then the water shifted. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, the level began to drop. The floating platform dipped slightly, just enough for the tables to wobble. Confused laughter turned into nervous glances. Servers stopped walking mid-step as the floor beneath them stopped feeling stable. Within minutes, confusion became panic. Confusion. The dock started separating from the shoreline as if the lake itself was retreating. Chairs scraped, dishes slid, and suddenly the floating restaurant wasn't floating at all. It was sinking into exposure, revealing how fragile their entire setup really was. And through it all, I just stood there watching. When the HOA president finally rushed toward me, shouting for me to stop, his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard before. I didn't raise mine. "You didn't build on community land," I said quietly. "You built on mine." And by the time the lake finished obeying me, the grand opening had turned into a stranded disaster, sitting in silence and mud, surrounded by people who finally understood one thing too late. Ownership isn't a suggestion. For a few seconds after the lake stopped draining, nobody spoke. Not the guests, not the staff, not even the HOA president who had been yelling just moments before. The entire floating restaurant sat stranded like a bad dream that refused to wake up properly, tilted, sinking into exposed mud, lights still flickering as if embarrassed to still be on. Then came the noise. Phones buzzing, people arguing, someone demanding refunds, someone else shouting about liability. The same crowd that had arrived laughing and taking selfies was now stepping carefully over wet planks, trying not to fall as the structure they trusted slowly collapsed under the weight of reality. And right in the middle of it all stood the HOA president, drenched in panic he could no longer hide. He looked around like he was waiting for someone else to fix it, someone else to blame, someone else to magically rewind what had already happened. He turned back to me again, but this time there was no confidence in his voice. "You can't just do this," he said, quieter now. "People invested time, money. This was for the community." I finally took a step forward, just one. "And you used my property to do it," I replied. Calm, steady, final. That's when the silence started spreading, not the peaceful kind, but the uncomfortable kind that forces people to realize they've been standing on the wrong side of a line the entire time. The dock groaned as it detached further, scraping against the shrinking shoreline. A few chairs toppled into the mud. Someone slipped, laughed nervously, then stopped laughing when they realized no one else was. The illusion was gone. What was supposed to be a grand opening had turned into a public collapse, of planning, of authority, of entitlement. And I didn't need to raise my voice once. By the time the water level stabilized, the floating restaurant wasn't a restaurant anymore. It was a stranded structure sitting awkwardly in the exposed bones of my lake, surrounded by confusion and wet footsteps leading nowhere. People started leaving in silence. No more filming, no more jokes, just the sound of defeated movement. The HOA president stayed behind longer than the rest, staring at what he thought he controlled. Finally, I spoke one last time. "This is what happens when you confuse access with ownership." Then I turned away. Behind me, the lake was quiet again, but the message wasn't. Because everyone there understood something they wouldn't forget anytime soon. You can rebuild a structure, but you can't rebuild respect once it sinks.